All right, so it's great to see you on this wonderful Tanya Tuesday. We're back, and I hope we can keep some consistency on the classes and actually do them on time. But last week I had to go to North Florida, and I got back at 4 in the morning. I wasn't ready to give a class at 12. But be that as it may, we have a very interesting class. It's more of a philosophical class, okay? At least the beginning of it, okay? And so. Um, a lot of times philosophically, discussing philosophical issues are important, um, because often our brains have trouble computing what um have trouble computing some of the concepts we talk about God. And yes, there's belief, but Judaism also believes in asking questions. And there are answers for those who want to delve deeply. Though, of course, ultimately, when you're talking about God, you're at some point going to hit a brick wall. Not because there isn't an explanation, but the explanation can never be fully understood. Why? Because God is infinite. God is beyond any being that we have in this world. So though we can give examples and though we can give ways to bring understanding God closer to our thought process, we can never truly understand God, just as you can never truly understand infinite itself, right? People think they can, but you can't. You can continuously counting infinite numbers, but that's not actually infinite because every number you add is still finite, right? So if you keep counting a million, a billion, a trillion, Google, and you keep going, it's still a finite number. Infinite is much more than just a conglomeration of multiple numbers. Its true infinity is truly impossible for us to wrap our minds around. The best thing I can imagine in my mind is something that just goes beyond the borders of my mind. But there is no. It's very difficult, and that's actually why interesting thought. Scientists have trouble figuring out where does this universe end because to say it's infinite doesn't really make any sense, right? So, there's you cannot put together enough finite pieces to make infinite. This is a lengthy discussion that's discussed in the Jewish philosophers. Um, you know, for example, the question is a billion closer to infinity than one? And the answer is no, because how can you get any closer to infinity? It's not possible. If it's truly infinite, you can't get any closer to infinity. So a billion cannot be any closer than one. They are both infinitely distant from true infinite. And so the scientists have trouble understanding the universe. Where is the end? And they assume there has to be an end because otherwise it's infinite, which doesn't make any sense because a physical space cannot be infinite because you can keep adding pieces to it, but eventually you're going to end somewhere. So they have two theories. One theory, as far as I understand, and I haven't looked it up recently, so don't quote me on this. One theory is, of course, the universe is circular. So as you get towards the end, you go in a curve, so you never really hit that end. It just curves you back in. And the other theory is the universe is constantly expanding, which would mean the universe is not infinite. But then the question becomes, but where is it expanding into? I mean, where is the space? And again, scientists are going to have to, figure this out. For those of us that believe in God, um, these questions become a little bit easier, knowing that we don't have to fully understand it. The world exists within God, and how it ends and where it ends, I don't have to worry so much, and figure out the science behind it. And maybe it's not something you can explain scientifically. I don't know anybody that's reached to the end of the universe to figure it out. Um, but this is the balance we have in religion, though, as well, is on the one hand, we want to understand as much as we can about God. At the same time, because God is truly infinite and truly infinite is impossible to ever fully comprehend in our minds, we are always going to have to rely on faith. And this is what it means in the Torah when it says, Da et Elokei avicha, know the God of your fathers. It means we have an obligation to know as much about God as we can. There's an obligation to learn as much about God as we can. So you say, well, if I can know God, what's the point of faith? The reason you need faith is because there are many elements of God that cannot be understood. In other words, though we can understand parts of God, there are parts of God that we cannot understand. And in fact, as we've discussed multiple times in the Tanya, the more you understand about God, the more you appreciate God. In other words, you can just say, well, we don't understand God. But the more you delve into God and realize how much you don't understand, the more, I would say, impressive and incredible God becomes. And we're going to see a little bit of that today as we explore a philosophical question about God, which was related to last week's discussion. And through that, you will have a greater appreciation for how much we don't understand God. That's really the beauty of learning about God. And as I've said many times throughout these Tanya classes, though not recently, is in Chabad Hasidus, we consider if you just rely on faith, we call that lazy faith. In other words, if you use faith for things about God that you can understand, then that's called lazy faith. So, in other words, though we accept on faith that God created the world and God creates us at every single moment, many of those concepts can also be understood. And there are rational arguments to say creation of the world is a more rational belief. There's a great book. I don't know if they have it in print anymore, but if you are into philosophy, there was a great Chabad philosopher who wrote, a great Chabad. Well, he studied philosophy. He was a teacher in college of philosophy. Sorry, he taught philosophy in London, Ontario. And I met him a couple times. And he wrote a book called God, Rationality, and Mysticism. Very great book. Really one of the best I've ever read for those who want a rational view on God. And basically he makes the argument that though you can never 1000% prove anything, that's an impossibility, which we can get into another day. But the more rational understanding is to believe that God created the world than to believe in the Big Bang or anything else. In other words, when you're weighing the rationality of the different possibilities, it's more rational to believe in creation. So that's my point. My point is that you can use your mind to understand the parts of God that we can, and then use the rest for faith. And that actually elevates our faith. It doesn't diminish our faith. And also, we should never say, well, if there's a part of God I don't understand, I don't believe in him. But by understanding God as much as we can, we actually elevate our faith by not having to use faith for the easier parts of God to understand. So hopefully you'll walk away with that appreciation today as we delve into a very fascinating question about God. And that is the question of, how does God know? So how do we get to this question today? We get to this question because last week we discussed that we have to utilize our das. Das is the third element of our mind that creates the connection between our thought process and our heart. And through das, deep, contemplative, focused meditation that we truly care about, we can take what we know and bring it into how we feel. And one of the things we need to know at all times is that God knows exactly what we're doing. So at a very basic level, if we were to just bring into our minds the knowledge and the understanding that God knows everything that is going on in our lives, how would we ever sin? If we would truly feel that God is with us at every single moment, it would be very, very difficult to sin. It's like, you know, I'm sure you just imagine a certain person in your life that you respect, that you know, and try to imagine sitting next to that person. It would be very, very hard. So the question becomes, all right, so God, I can truly bring into my mind that God knows everything that's happening, and um, and therefore I will not come to sin. That was really the point of last chapter. The problem is, the question we need to ask ourselves is, how does God know? How does God know what's happening? How does God know? So any thoughts? How does God know? How does God know what we're doing? We're saying you need to meditate that God knows what we're doing. Can anybody either tell me how God knows or tell me any issues you see with God knowing everything that we're doing?
Well, he's omniscient, so he knows everything that's going on at all times. I don't know how you prove that, but there's no way to sit there and say that I can prove this. It's like
So right. So
you
you're
talked
telling
about
me what he
before the
is.
last couple hours, the last couple of minutes, you're talking about not being able to prove something 100%.
Right.
Well, this is something you can't prove 100%.
Right. But
I
you're
guess
telling me
I
what
guess I'm
God is doing.
late.
My question is, how does God do it?
How does God do it?
Yeah, not what does he do. We know he is all
Oh,
knowing.
if we knew that, we would be somewhere else, I think.
Right.
Right. So the problem is that the sages said you always have to know there's an eye that sees. So it sounds like God is seeing us. Is there a problem with saying that? It's
But does God really see everything everybody is doing every second of every day? And
so
how?
you're saying he's too busy.
Yeah,
I
I think it's kind of busy.
would say there'd be a lot of disappointment.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't know if you can handle that. Maybe he can handle or she can handle that much disappointment, but
Right.
it's because we're faulty creatures. So
Speak for yourself, but continue. No, I'm kidding.
I'm listen, I am speaking for myself. I think in general we're faulty
Yeah,
creatures.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, again, to reach the levels that we are talking about here, we can go back to chapter one and talk about Rushes and Betanis. I mean, and say,
Right.
but many of us will never even get to Betani. So we keep trying. Maybe we have moments, but again, how can we know what's going on if we can't even get to Betani?
Right. So you're saying God would be very disappointed if he followed everything.
I would say he'd like if you look at God as a parent and you looked at all your children and you saw what was going on, yeah, there are lots of good things, but there's some bad things too. So
Right. Sometimes it's better not to know.
I don't know about that, but sometimes it's just can be overwhelming.
Well,
Put it that way.
listen, it's a good point we're making here. Think about our own lives. If our parents knew everything about us, not to mention when we talk about God's all-knowing, we're talking about our thoughts as well, right? So, I mean, imagine our parents knew everything about us. I think it would be difficult for them. I think it would be difficult for them. And so in some ways it's a blessing. Maybe we don't know everything about our kids, so how does God handle it? But if our sages tell us that one way to prevent sin is to know that there's always an eye that sees, that means we must believe that God is always seeing. So God does see everything. There's an eye that sees, and they mean he's seeing everything. Otherwise, it wouldn't stop you from sinning. You could say, well, God's not seeing me right now, right? Now, if we made exclusions that God doesn't see everything, then that whole teaching would not apply, right? If we say, no, there's always an eye that sees and an ear that hears and everything's being written down. So God knows everything. How does God handle it? Well, he's infinite. So that would be my explanation. Can he handle all this information? And can he deal with our issues? Well, he's not human. We're human. We have trouble, looking at people one way and knowing certain details about them, right? We're very flawed as human beings. Once we know a little bit about someone, if we know them too much, it becomes harder to respect them. God is infinite, and He can handle things. He's not human. He can handle things the way we can't. I would say
Wait a
that for
minute.
number
I
one.
say we're flawed. You say speak for yourself. You say we're flawed. You're fine. I don't understand this, Rabbi.
I'm only flawed in my judgment of others, but I'm perfect. I'm flawed. I have trouble looking at other people when I know their flaws. Okay, no, I'm kidding. Um, um, so, but the question is like this. Okay, so now let's assume for a moment. So now let's take the first point. So let's assume, which is a very important point, we have to meditate and imagine. Okay, the first thing we have to believe in order to prevent us from sin. This is what we said earlier. Literally believe that God knows every single moment, very cognizant of your thought, your speech, and action. Okay? Now, the question as to can God handle it? Well, if we believe God is infinite, then I believe God can handle it. But now the question is, how does he gain that knowledge? How does he gain that knowledge? So we said there's an eye that sees and an ear that hears. Now, the problem is that um, God doesn't have eyes or ears. So, how exactly does God know? And so, here we have to come to a very, very important philosophical point. And that philosophical point is number one, the Torah uses all the time physical descriptions of God. And those physical descriptions are, as you can say, ways for us to at least understand a little bit about what God is doing, even if he's not doing it in that way. In other words, when we say God has an eye that sees, it doesn't literally mean he has a physical eye, but it's something that we can appreciate. Seeing is through the eyes. So we say there's an eye that sees, it's a way that we can understand. So that's number one. So let's take a look at the text that deals with the physical aspect of saying God has an eye. Still doesn't answer how does God know without an eye? But let's see. The above quote describes God in physical terms as having a seeing eye, a hearing ear. Obviously, this is a metaphor since God does not have actual eyes by the page 536, chapter 42. God does not have actual eyes and ears. But if God's eyes and ears are not literal, is the idea that he's watching over us also non-literal? The Tanya assures us that this is not the case. And while God's seeing eye and hearing ear are metaphorical, since God has no semblance of a body, that doesn't mean that God isn't really watching you, but to the contrary, the fact that he doesn't use actual eyes or ears means his awareness of you is greater. In other words, God has only when we talk about God, everything we could talk about God is only a plus and never a minus. In other words, if we say God has eyes, we don't literally mean he has eyes. And even the meaning of his eyes that see, he only has the benefit of seeing and not the downside of seeing. Okay? In other words, what's the downside of eyes? Um, Eyes are very limited. It has a limited how far you can see, limited in scope, limited in X-ray vision. In other words, we know there are things around us that our physical eyes cannot see. God's eyes, so to speak, which are not eyes, are not limited. Okay? So let's assume for a moment God has eyes, but not really eyes, but he has super eyes, and ears, but not ears like us, but ears that can hear everything, right? So, for example, our ears can only hear certain things. God's ears can hear the frequency of the radio and everything. He hears everything, right? There are many things we know that exist that we cannot see and hear. God can obviously see and hear all of it, but the problem is um, that if we're going to say that God knows things through vision, through ears, there's a very big problem with that. And that is that God doesn't change. Now, when we learn information through our eyes and our ears, we are gaining new information. Okay, so let us say, for example, there was no iPhone 17. Then I become aware of the iPhone 17. Someone tells me about it, and then I see it. I have now gathered new knowledge about something that I had no idea about. Something was added to me. The knowledge of the phone was added to me. In other words, all of our senses that interact with the world around us add something to us that wasn't a part of us before. That's going to be a problem with God because we don't want to add anything to God. God is not changing. So let's say, for example, it would never happen, but let's say I were to sin, right? And God would gain that knowledge. Now God has new information that has come to him from outside of him to inside of him. Okay? Let us take a look at um, let us take a look at the inside, how they deal with this. Um, so we're answering the question, how does God acquire knowledge? So till now we said God has supervision, super ears, but it's much more than that. Our sages hinted to this idea by stating everything is revealed and known before him. The sages could have phrased this more simply and said God knows. Why did they employ the somewhat cumbersome phrase that everything is revealed and known before him? As the Tanya will explain, the sages chose this phrase to teach us that God doesn't acquire knowledge in the same way that we do. For us mortals, there is a process. Initially, we lack knowledge about a certain thing. Then we will gain access to some information, and after analyzing the information with our minds, we end up with knowledge. But this sharp dualism between the subject you and object the knowledge cannot be true about God who is utterly one. God must know everything without having to go through the process of actually coming to know it. That is why the sages implied that everything is already revealed and known before him in past tense, without him having to actively acquire that knowledge. Through example, knowing in this way, and this is just an example, God's awareness of you is infinitely greater than, for example, through seeing with eyes or hearing with ears. As we said, the problem is you are gaining information about something. The fact that God doesn't need eyes or ears to acquire knowledge doesn't make his awareness of your actions any less. Since he doesn't suffer from any dualism, God's knowledge is actually more powerful because there's no schism between him and what he knows. So how is there no schism between what is him and what he knows? So he explains. And even though this concept defies coherent mortal comprehension, the Tanya will now teach us an analogy to offer some insight into the way God knows things automatically. So this goes back to what I said earlier. We're going to understand as much as we can, while admitting we can never fully understand it. So let us continue. Rather, by way of illustration, God knows everything, not through an active process of acquiring knowledge, but like a person who knows and feels everything that's happening and occurring in each of the 248 limbs of his body, like cold or heat, or even, to give an extreme example, heat in the toenail when it's scorched by fire. And a person also intuitively knows the status of the actual limb themselves in their core, and all that is affected in them, he knows and feels automatically in his brain without having to consciously collect the information. In other words, our senses generally are gathering information that exists in the world around us. The Tanya is saying, though, the knowledge that God gathers, because everything is one with him, is not a knowledge that you gather of the world around you, but it is the knowledge of you yourself. Just as when you feel your hand hurting, you don't um, look at it, hear about it, process it, and then it becomes a part of you, right? When you feel your hand hurting, it's you that you're feeling. You're feeling yourself. So there's nothing outside of God. The world is all found within God and in God's power, and God has to vivify it in every single moment, as we explained in chapter 21 and 22. And so, therefore, God's ability to know what is going on in your life and my life and the sins that we do, we tend to think, oh, can God see it and process it and figure it all out? So I said before he has to be infinite, but it's much more than that. It's not like when we sin or when we don't sin or whatever we do or whatever we think, he has to process all that information in a typical way. It's all happening within him, and he feels it. The word feel actually is a hard word to say. He knows it, right? So he is not being fed data about your life. The data about your life is within him, and he feels it just as much as you would feel your hand hurting. Crazy thought. Any questions or comments? No? Okay. So the Tanya is going to explain, though. Well, actually, let me read the next paragraph before I continue. So the Tanya is going to just elaborate on this point, and then I will go to the problem with this understanding. In a vaguely, right, how they write, in a vaguely comparable fashion, and he'll explain why it's only comparable to this example of automatic knowledge from within, God knows everything that happened to all creations, upper and lower, since the life energy of all creations flows from him. As the verse states, for from you all things come, and we say, and no creature is hidden from you. The world's existence, on the high holiday, we say that prayer. We say that prayer. We say, it's actually a very important line. This is from the liturgy of the high holidays. On the high holiday prayers, we say it doesn't quote everything, but it says, you know everything. Sorry, it says, I had the quote here. I had it. We say, gosh, the point is, we say in the prayers, we say on the one hand, we say that God knows everything, because that's part of the liturgy of the high holiday prayers, that God knows everything. And we also say that everything is flows from you. And those two statements are connected. In other words, if everything flows from God, then automatically he knows everything. Okay? That's why we say, but that's why no creature is hidden from you. Yitzur, because they're created from you, therefore they're not hidden from you. So, anyways, let me read this. The world's existence flows directly from God and is intimately connected with Him. That's why He simply has knowledge of everything automatically without having to acquire the knowledge. It's not dissimilar to the way you feel pain in your toe. You don't have to think, I wonder if my toe hurts, and then go and find out. When it hurts, you simply know. The Tanya now cites sources from Jewish philosophical and mystical traditions to the above point. As Rambam, Maimonides writes, and the Kabbalists have concurred, as stated by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who was the famous Kabbalist before the Arizal, that from knowing himself, so to speak, God knows all creations. In other words, if we believe God knows himself, then he knows everything. Yes? You want to say something?
No, keep going. I'll wait till you get to the point. Yep.
Ah. Since everything that exists in the heavens and the earth and everything in between only exists from the truth of his existence. So all existence is in a sense a part of him. Maimonides writes, since he knows himself, he knows everything. And we're quoting here directly from Maimonides. There's nothing hidden from him. He doesn't know by means of an external knowledge that is separated from him the way we know things, because we and our knowledge are not identical, meaning we are separate from our knowledge. What we know and who we are two separate things. Before the Creator may he be blessed, he, his knowledge, and existence are absolutely one. He is the knower, right? He is the known, so that's the thing that you know, and he has the power to know itself, all as one. The Ramak, which is the Kabbalist, explains Maimonides' statements according to Kabbalah. The power to know, he writes, corresponds to Keser, an energy that is aloof from the created universe, and therefore precedes any knowledge of it. The knower refers to the inquisitive mind of God, so to speak, his Chokhmah, and the known is Bina, the power through which God acquires real cognitive knowledge. And while all 10 spheral divine energies are united within God, Ramak reminds us that there are 7 different gradations in this unity, in contrast to the lower sphirot, whose connectedness to God's influence will fluctuate. The first 3, Keser, Chachma, and Bina, are united with Him in absolute oneness, to the extent that even after they've been emanated, wondrous things are said about their unity that the first 3 are considered as one. And all that, not getting into the Kabbalah of it, but the point is Ramak is saying that the unity of which God knows things is a complete unity. All right, so before we get to the problem with this parable, yes, what's the question?
So it's almost like a giant neural net.
Mm-hmm.
You could think of it that way, where it's all within God is this giant neural net where he has everything. And it's not like he has to get that thing, it's already within him.
Correct.
So it's a bit fascinating to try to understand that. Does he do that via our soul? Is our soul,
No, everything in this world is created from him, and therefore, since it's always bound with him, he knows it just as you know yourself.
but I know myself, but I don't know what I'm going to do.
Right, but there's
I've
nothing
been-
else, there's nothing, everything else in this world is separate from you. There's nothing that can truly ever separate itself from God.
Right, but that's what I'm saying. I don't know what I'm going to do 5 minutes from now.
Oh, well, that's a different human issue.
He knows what I'm going to do 5 minutes from now. He's
Well,
already
for,
he already has felt that.
well, for him, the past, present, and future is all in the same.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. So that makes it even more
Right.
difficult to comprehend.
Right. That's another layer which we're not even getting into. We're just without dealing with the problem of the future. Just right now, if you were to sin, how would he know what you did? Without getting to he already knew you were going to do it. That's another question.
Right, because he knows I might sin 5 minutes from now. I don't know.
Correct. Correct.
Now, I don't know that I'm going to sin 5 minutes from now, but he knows that I'm going to may know that I'm going to sin five
Right.
minutes from
But even right now, as you sit in your room with all the things around you, You do not, they are external to you, though you may know them. The
Right.
knowledge of them
That's
is
what I'm saying.
external
It's
to
like a
you.
neural net. He's like a neural
Yeah,
net.
yeah, yeah. Everything is a part of him. And therefore, um, he doesn't gain more knowledge. We're just a piece of him. We don't become a piece of knowledge that he knows about. Oh wow, Steve Jobs came up with this cool iPhone. That's nice. You know, those are all a part of him. Um, so there's a problem with this, though. The problem is that if we're going, this is where parables always fall short. If we're going to say that God knows things like we know our bodies, then there's another problem, which is that God would be affected by us. Meaning, just as in our bodies, when uh, something happens to a part of our body, we have changed, right? So if I stub my toe, I know that with the knowledge of myself. It's not an external knowledge, but at the same time, my toe is broken, right? Are we now suddenly going to be affecting God? Okay? And so that's what he's going to say is it's a one-way parable. It only applies to the benefits of the greatness of God, but not to, so to speak, bringing God down. We cannot, doesn't God will know about our pain, but it doesn't mean that he feels pain because he doesn't change. Let's take a look here. He says like this. He says, but this illustration of God acquiring knowledge effortlessly, like a person feels his limbs, serves only to calm the ear in attempt to render the incomprehensible comprehensible. I like that word. But in truth, the illustration from man bears no resemblance to reality in God whatsoever, as the Tanya will now explain. For God doesn't know the world as a result of being influenced by it, but that's not true of a person's. Sorry, for God doesn't know the world as a result of being influenced by it. Okay? That's the difference. But that's not true of a person's soul, since even the more aloof intellectual divine souls are influenced by what's happening to the body and by its pain. Right? So, because the intellectual soul are actually enmeshed in the energizing animal soul, which is actually enmeshed in the body, and that is how they know what's happening in the body. So, even the highest element of your soul, your godly soul, which knows what's happening in your body, um, it gets affected by your body. But the Blessed Holy One is not in any way influenced, God forbid, by the happenings of the world and its fluctuations, nor by the world itself. None of this brings about change in him, God forbid. Comparing God's knowledge to the way you know there's pain in your toe is both helpful and unhelpful. It's helpful in the sense that it enables you to get some idea how God's knowledge is not actively acquired but intuitively known. But it's unhelpful because it implies incorrectly that God's knowledge is influenced by the world like your toe, which hurts you. And Tanya offers us the illustration to provide some insight, provided that we are aware of its limitations. So again, we gave you an example, but ultimately, understanding how God's knowledge works is going to be beyond us. Because any example we ever give about God are always going to have drawbacks. So that's generally how it works. When we discuss God, we give parables that help us understand a certain element, but they can never be fully true because, again, God is infinite. And so we start to understand a little bit about God, and so I would say this discussion has elevated very much so our knowledge of how God knows us. I would say before you came to the class today, when people think of God watching, they think of God watching, like literally, like, as what they describe the old man in the sky, as some people used to call it, right? So God is like standing there watching you, and that's a description that's used in many places. But if we were to change that view, and you might say, well, maybe God's not looking, or maybe God's doesn't, whatever, it's external. But if we understand that God's knowledge is like a part of Him, then there's no escaping ever His knowledge. In other words, there's no way to ever even think that we can do something that He would know about because He would feel it right away. And even the word feel is a bad word, but that's what it means. It totally changes our perspective and knowledge. So this gives us a little bit of a reason of understanding why when we talk about God, on the one hand, we try to understand Him as much as we can, yet admitting what we don't know. It gives us a greater appreciation for God and helps us connect with God more, while still understanding God is well above whatever we can understand. And so the typical ability of God, the greatest ability of God that you will find throughout whenever you study about God is God's ability for opposites. That means God's ability to be one thing, which is generally the opposite of another, but he can do both at the same time, right? So, for example, it says when God brought the hail upon the Egyptians, it was a hail with ice and fire, two opposites together. Why did God do that? Because that's God's signature trademark, that God can do opposites. That's a trademark of being God. Is things don't logically flow. You can do things that are opposite. Or, for example, what it says when God gave us the Torah, it said we saw God, and that's also why it says we saw the thunder and heard the lightning, which usually is the other way around, right? Usually you see the lightning and you hear the thunder. But again, this goes to the point that um, God's signature is, so to speak, the ability for opposites. And it's also an empowering message in our lives is that sometimes we don't see how things could work out, but don't worry. If you have the power of God, the power of our opposite behind you, anything can be possible. You know the philosophers used to ask the question, can God create a rock that he can't pick up? And so their answer was, well, anything we talk about God can only be a benefit, a plus and not a minus. So they would say the answer is no, because um, it's not a plus to create a rock that you can't pick up. But the Kabbalists will tell you, and I hope I'm not confusing you, maybe, that God could create a rock that he can't pick up and he'll pick it up anyways. Why? Because God exists in opposites. Okay? So he'll create a rock that he can't pick up and he'll pick it up anyways, because God exists in opposites. And this is, again, it's twist your mind in a pretzel a little bit, but that's the idea. The idea is that we need to understand as much as we can about God while admitting at a certain point that God is beyond us. And this is what he's going to get to next. This is what he's going to tell us, is that we should understand God, but also believe with faith. So he says like this. In order for us to understand all this as much as possible with our mortal minds, the Kabbalists have already discussed it at length in their works, but all of this is essentially, I'm actually going to skip the word unnecessary because this actually is necessary. The guy that wrote the commentary, okay, the bold is the original. However, all of Israel are believers, the children of believers, without any investigation via human intellect, and we say you were alone before the world was created, as mentioned above, chapter 20. The reason why I say it's not necessary is my point here. My point is, no, we should use our minds as much as possible. At the same time, always realizing that whatever we don't understand, we are believers, and so we understand we are not going to understand exactly how God knows everything and still is the same God before the world was created. But it is very necessary to try and use our minds to understand as much as we can about God without ever saying that I'll only believe if I understand. Now, to back up, if someone is not a believer yet, okay, you can start from the intellectual perspective, but many of us here are already believers. And if you're already a believer, the use of intellect is not to come to what we believe in. The use of intellect is to understand as much as we can. Okay? And I would say for myself and for a lot of people, I would say like this. There's a certain uh, you know, through intellect, we come to a basic understanding of God, and we, so to speak, make our decision to believe in God. But much of the rest that we know about God, we take on faith. That's how I would say a lot of people do it. In other words, intellectually, there has to be a God. Intellectually, Judaism is correct. Intellectually, there's a lot of intellectual things, and through that, kind of, you come to a place where eventually you say, well, all this is really, I'll believe, right? So in other words, for some people, the start of it is intellect. Um, Whatever. Again, everybody's going to have their own journey. But let's continue. Here, the Tanya has touched upon a delicate and nuanced question. When given the choice between simple faith and reason, which approach will lead us to the closest to the most genuine appreciation of God? Of the two approaches, reason, um, I turn my pages here. Um, you know what? Reason appears at first glance to be the most seriously flawed, for it is obvious that human intellect is incapable of grasping God's true self. However sophisticated one's understanding of the Creator may become, it is but a finite conception which bears little resemblance to the infinite Creator. When we believe in God, on the other hand, we have faith in how he truly exists, how he defies any mortal conception or imagination. So faith seems to be superior. But faith too is limited. It tends to reject the empirical sensory reality that we know, so it is not easily internalized normally into everyday life. So it's interesting. He's now explaining what I was saying earlier. Just I don't know why I said faith is sorry, reason is unnecessary. You should never put that word in. But he's explaining now the two coins. On the one hand, faith gets you to the true belief in God, but faith also has a limitation that it's not easily internalized in normal everyday life. In this respect, the superior quality of intellect becomes apparent. While the mind may not grasp God as he is, nevertheless, that which the intellect does succeed in understanding about God becomes real and tangible. Once grasped, intellectual concepts sit comfortably in the mind and become thoroughly internalized. Since faith and reason each have their own advantages, the Tanya stresses the need for both. This is the virtue in the arguments that the Kabbalists have discussed at length in their works, and then there is also the virtue of Israel being believers, the children of believers. So that wraps up that section. I think a beautiful wrap up again. This is one example, but there are many, many examples that one can do when it comes to belief and faith in God. Many people often say, well, some people will say, I understand what I understand, and what I don't understand, whatever, I don't believe in. We have to understand that if you never believe, there are many, many parts of God that you're not going to know that exists, because much of God has to be taken on faith, because it's impossible to understand it. At the same time, those who go with just faith are also lacking in their service of God, because we need to endeavor to understand as much about God as we can, because what we do understand as human beings becomes more internalized into who we are. Okay? Any questions or comments before we go to the next part? No? Okay. So now we need to recap where we're at, because this was kind of a side discussion to our more general discussion. We started off chapter 42 to remind ourselves. We started off with a question, is that Moses said we should all fear God. And he said it's very easy. And we wanted to understand, how is it easy? So we started off in the beginning of chapter 42 that explaining at length how every single Jew has a spark of Moses, and that spark of Moses is the ability for Das, the ability to know God and to connect with it. And we explained a little bit more about Das as we continued. It requires great exertion of the body, great exertion of the soul, and how we have to attach our mind to an idea and think about it deeply and caring about it deeply. And then we continued today to explain one of the concepts, and that is God's knowledge of us, which is one of the concepts we need to meditate on that will help us fear God. And so by giving us the intellectual understanding of God's knowledge of us, that's, so to speak, a concept you can meditate on. Okay? Um, so, but now that we're here, so now he's going to finalize exactly why why fear of God is easy. And the answer is because what's demanded of us is to meditate about God. In other words, if the commandment was to fear God, you'd be like, how, what, when, where, right? But the commandment is to meditate about God. And once you meditate about God, we know that you have the spark of Moses within you, and it will not remain in theory, and it will come to actuality. And so this is what he says. This is what he explains over here. Let's read it inside. So again, this is answering our question. How can we say that fear of God is easy? So he says, now every person in Israel, whoever he may be, if he will meditate on this each day for an extended period of time, how the blessed Holy One literally fills the upper and lower worlds, the heaven and the earth, and all the earth is filled with his glory literally, and that God watches and sees and he's checking your inclinations and your heart, as well as all your actions and words, and he counts your every step. So again, if you think about this deeply, okay, and you have right? The Tanya now suggests that you keep the above meditation up your sleeve so that when you are confronted with a challenge to your Torah observance during the day, you can revisit the meditation for a moment to avoid doing something you will later regret. Okay, so meditate about this idea, and then you will not come to sin. Um, that's the wrong page, right? We were supposed to go from page 540 to 541. I must have taken pictures twice. Okay. And having carried out this meditation once in the morning, then throughout the entire day, reverence will be fixed in your heart, so that if you will revisit the meditation, even for a brief moment, when necessary to avoid temptation, then at any time or moment you'll be able to turn away from evil and do good in thought, speech, and action, so as not to rebel against his honor, God forbid, while you are in God's presence, which fills all the earth, as is the above mentioned saying of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So recall, we spoke about this at depth last week. I said, imagine the boiler in your home. It's very, very hot there, and it spreads hot water to the rest of your house. But in order to have hot water in the rest of your house, you need to have super hot water in the boiler, the water heater, whatever it is. The same thing is about our meditation, about the knowledge that God is always seeing us. We need to meditate at length in the morning to really boil it up, right? Before our prayers in the morning. And then throughout the day, you can tap into that meditation much easier. But you need to rekindle that meditation every single day. In other words, to say that it's easy to not sin because we always remember God sees us, that doesn't work if you just think about it the moment you're ready to sin. You're about to sin, you say, well, God knows that, I know God is watching. Yeah, but you don't feel it, right? Because remember, without das, without pulling it from your mind into your emotions, that knowledge is not going to change how you feel and act. That's why the whole the Tanya is telling you the secret. If we say it's easy to fear God, it's easy to fear God if you follow the right steps. Someone once said, uh, maybe another way to say it is maybe it's not easy, but it's simple, right? So I don't know if the word is easy necessarily, but it's simple. In other words, there are steps to follow, and if you do that, you will be successful. I know it's an interesting example, but let's take an example of Dave Ramsey's ideas, right? There are many ways to get rich, but he has a simple, stupid system, right? Just work a little hard, put away a little extra money in mutual funds, and you'll be a millionaire by the time you retire, right? It's very simple, it's very stupid, and it works, right? There are other ways to get rich and might get you richer much quicker and faster and but he's giving you a very simple, easy step-by-step thing that anybody and everybody can do, right? And so the same thing that Tanya's making the argument here. Lahavdil, of course, Lahavdil. Tanya's making the argument that I'm giving you simple steps. So I don't know if the word is easy. It's not easy, but it's simple. If you follow these steps, you will be successful. You will be able to bring this knowledge of God everywhere, and you will be able to feel God at every single moment, and you will not sin. And so his formula is every single morning you wake up, before you pray, you have to spend a good amount of time on meditative contemplation about God's knowledge. Okay? And by meditating about God's knowledge, you will start to feel it. And every person, some will take longer, some will take less. It depends on who you are. And once you feel it, you can tap into that feeling multiple times a day. But if you do this once a week or once a month, obviously its effect will be limited. It will be limited. It'll be limited because you haven't thought about it recently, right? It's so what they talk about. A lot of these people are big into motivation. They talk about a lot of them talk about making yourself a motivation reel, or before you want to start exercising, you have to like create a whole collage of motivation. So you'll know, so you can always, when you need to tap into your motivation, why you're putting in this hard work, you can tap into it and you'll go ahead and do it. Right? So again, this idea is written already in the Tanya. It's not some new self-help books that figured it out. It's written in the Tanya that motivation is the fuel. Motivation is the fuel to be able to accomplish the right actions. And motivation is something that, when it comes to physical things, might be easier. Okay, when it comes to your health, the motivation might be easier because at the very least, for some people, at least when they exercise, they feel better. When they eat better, they feel better right away. When you don't sin physically, you don't see anything better right away. You have to, it requires more meditation than I would say than a typical motivation reel. That's what I would add over here. So let's just conclude over here looking at this text over here. This concludes our meditation aimed at this concludes our meditation aimed at reaching a minimal level of lower reverence, the basic awareness that someone is watching me, so I need to behave. But how can we be sure that a minimal reverence is sufficient to fill the verse, what does God, your God, ask of you? Only that you revere God, from Deuteronomy. Tanya will now show this from the verse itself. And the fact that the verse requires only a minimal level of reverence can be discerned from what is stated at the end of the verse. God asks you only that you revere God, your God, to go in all his ways. That's the trick. It says you have to revere God to go in his ways. In other words, you require at least the basic reverence that will make you follow what God asks of you. The second half of the verse, to go in all his ways, clarifies that the level of reverence required by the first half, only that you revere God, your God. This implies you need to have at least a reverence sufficient to motivate the observance of God mitzvos. There are higher levels of reverence that Tanya is going to discuss later, but you have to have at least this very basic level of reverence. To go in all his ways, enough to turn away from evil and do good. And this reverence refers to all the levels of lower reverence mentioned above in chapter 41, including the awareness that someone is watching me, so I need to behave. The verse is content with any level of reverence which will lead to practical observance. This would include all of the levels of lower reverence which we discussed in chapter 41, including the most basic level described by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that someone is watching me, so I need to behave. And as the Talmud explains for Moshe, meaning for the quality of das found in the divine soul of all of Israel, which is nurtured by Moses' soul, it's a small thing. It's definitely possible for everyone to nurture that reverence as explained above, right? As we said, if you meditate about something with deep concentration and caring, whatever you're meditating about God will lead to your feelings and therefore will lead to action. Since, as those familiar with the hidden Kabbalistic wisdom know, Das is what connects the hidden understanding of the heart with a substantive conscious thought. As we learned above, even if Das doesn't bring you to have palpable feelings for God in your heart, it will at the very least bring these feelings to substantive conscious thought. Das is the bridge between your soul's natural latent feelings for God and your consciousness. That was something we discussed another time. But so the point is that to serve God, though there are deeper levels of reverence, the most simple thing we need to know, and it sounds stupid, but it's simple. If we were to walk around every single day, okay, this is where we should start from in our lives. And this starts from chapter 41. Remember that chapter 41 said the most basic thing every single person needs is a basic level of reverence to know that God is watching all our deeds. And Tanya has expounded upon that throughout the chapters 41 and 42. That the start where people are wondering, I want to know how to fear God. I want to know I want to know how to be truly tremble, be ashamed of God. I want to know how to love God at the highest levels, right? I see that person, they love God so much like a tzaddik. Those are lofty levels, but the most basic thing we all should try to bring into our lives, and the first thing we should try to do in our lives is to feel in our hearts through deep contemplative meditation that God knows everything in a very intimate way that is going on with our lives. And that knowledge alone would change our actions at every single moment. And we've discussed that, we know it works physically when certain people are around us or when people are around us in general, right? We know there's the concept, the hot mic or, people in their car when people cut them off in traffic, certain things they say. But what if we felt that God is always going with us? God is much more important than anybody else that could be going with us. And therefore, it's very, very important that at the very least, we start off our prayers, we start off our morning ritual with a meditation that will bring us to feel that God is right there watching us, and not just watching us from the outside, but feeling us. It's a crazy, crazy thought to have. But that's the truth. And if you can bring that into your life, you will become a different person. And so it's not easy, but it's simple. That is the lessons of the Tanya, and it's so simple. That's what I'm getting to. It's so simple, and just people are looking for something else, and it's fascinating. Everyone's looking for like spirituality, and there's all different things people are seeking, but this is just such a basic idea to bring into our lives. With that, I'm going to stop recording. and open up for any questions.